apprentice as the circus flyer, a man of incredible skill and daring, and faith in the hands of his partner.
At 80, Burt Lancaster finally said it. He had fallen in love with men. Some were stars, some were friends. All of them were secrets. And for decades, no one knew. In the golden age of Hollywood, where image was everything and the price of honesty was exile, Burt lived two lives, one on screen, one in the shadows. What you're about to hear is one of Hollywood's most deeply buried truths. If stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal what the cameras never showed, take a second to like this video and subscribe for more. Because some of the most powerful truths come not from headlines, but from what was never meant to be heard. Burt Lancaster was a legend, but what he hid may be more human, more raw, and more unforgettable than any role he ever played. This is the story he couldn't tell in his prime, the one that waited until the very end to be spoken, and once you hear it, you may never see him the same way again. Burt Lancaster was born in 1913 in the rough, working-class streets of East Harlem, New York. The son of Irish-American parents, he was raised with strict discipline, hard labor, and an image of manhood forged in steel and grit. In a world where emotions were weakness and tenderness was unspoken, young Burt learned early how to armor himself. He excelled in sports, especially gymnastics, and his tall, broad-shouldered frame quickly became both his defense and his currency. After a brief stint in college, he joined the circus as an acrobat, swinging high above crowds with precision and flair. It was there, not in Hollywood, where Burt first understood the seductive power of performance. The thrill of being watched, the control of attention, the mask of the strong man. But behind that mask, he was already hiding something more delicate, more dangerous than stage fright. In the Army during World War II, he served with quiet honor. But it was after the war, when he entered Hollywood through the 1946 film The Killers, that his legend began. Lancaster exploded onto the screen, a physical, commanding presence with sharp eyes and a controlled fury that drew both men and women to him. He was dangerous, he was magnetic, and he became, almost overnight, a symbol of post-war masculinity. But with that symbol came rules. There were whispers in the industry about men who lived different lives, gay actors who disappeared overnight, studio contracts that included morality clauses, tabloids that destroyed careers with a single rumor. To survive in that world, you needed more than talent. You needed secrets, and you needed silence. Lancaster was no fool. He played the game. He dated women in public, often beautiful, often younger. He married 3 times. He had children. But the rumors never fully went away. There were stories from sets, from private gatherings, from friends of friends. Stories that Burt had shared quiet romances with men, sometimes co-stars, sometimes strangers who only knew him as a gaze across the room. He never confirmed them. He never denied them. Instead, he lived in a suspended space between truth and myth, allowing the image of Burt Lancaster to become something greater than the man himself. A Hollywood god who could be everything to everyone. But privately, things were more fragile. Friends noted that he was intensely guarded, introspective, prone to long silences and sudden retreats. He could be warm, even passionate, but there was always a part of him that remained locked away. And no matter how many films he made, how many awards he won, he never truly let the public inside. It wasn't shame that kept him quiet. It was survival. And survival in Hollywood, especially in those decades, meant understanding the price of being seen too clearly. So Burt Lancaster kept moving. From Here to Eternity to Elmer Gantry to Birdman of Alcatraz, he built a career on complex masculine characters who often carried contradictions. Preachers with demons, criminals with souls, lovers with violence just beneath the surface. Roles that, in hindsight, mirrored the man himself more than anyone realized. Because even as he rose to the top of the studio system, he carried with him the weight of knowing that who he loved could destroy everything he had built. In the 1950s and 60s, Burt Lancaster reigned at the peak of his fame. He was not just a star, he was a power broker. A man who could get films made, shape scripts, choose directors. He started his own production company, Hecht Hill Lancaster, becoming one of the first actors to truly seize creative control in a studio-driven era. His choices were bold, political, sometimes controversial. And while Hollywood praised his ambition, very few saw the deeper reason behind his need for control. Control for Lancaster was never just about storytelling. It was about protection. He knew how easily things could slip, how a whisper, a wrong photograph, a too close friendship could send everything crashing. So he remained careful, distant. Even in personal relationships, there was a limit. He had close friends in the industry, but few ever described true intimacy with him. Those who got closest said there was always something he held back, some piece of himself that never fully stepped into the light. And yet, there were moments, rare and fleeting, that suggested another truth beneath the surface. One of those moments came during the filming of The Swimmer in 1968. The movie itself was surreal, strange, and deeply personal. A story about a man moving through the backyards and pools of suburban America, trying to reclaim his past. Behind the scenes, Lancaster was deeply invested in the role. Friends and crew later said the film mirrored something inside him, a search for lost time, for youth, for unspoken truths. It was one of the few projects where he allowed vulnerability to rise just below the surface. There were relationships too, quiet ones. Rumors long surrounded his close bond with certain male actors, particularly in his early years. One name that surfaces in whispers is actor Nick Cravat, his lifelong friend and circus partner. The two were inseparable for decades, traveling together, working together, and sharing a closeness that defied standard definitions. Cravat never married. Neither did Lancaster after his third divorce. They were always seen together, and yet never questioned publicly, protected perhaps by their mutual silence. Lancaster was also known to frequent discreet gatherings, the kind of underground parties where Hollywood's LGBTQ community found momentary freedom. These were spaces without photographers, without headlines, just connection. It was there, according to sources later revealed in biographies and private letters, that Lancaster formed short-lived but intense connections with other actors. Some of them married, some of them legends in their own right. But even as he navigated these two lives, he carried guilt. Not for who he was, but for how much he had to hide. He was an activist in public, a supporter of civil rights, outspoken against McCarthyism and the Vietnam War. But on the matter of his own identity, he remained silent. The contradiction weighed on him. By the 1970s, Burt Lancaster was aging out of the romantic lead roles that had once defined him. He shifted into character work, appearing in acclaimed films like Atlantic City and Local Hero. He played older men, wiser, sadder, sometimes alone. And audiences noticed something had changed. There was a deeper melancholy in his performances, a longing. Perhaps it was the weight of time. Perhaps it was the truth pressing harder against the edges of his public image. Or perhaps it was simply that Burt Lancaster had spent a lifetime playing strong men on screen, while quietly carrying the ache of not being able to love as freely as he had lived. It wasn't until the final chapter of his life that Burt Lancaster began to speak more openly, not on television, not in magazines, but in private letters, recorded conversations with biographers, and late-night reflections with friends who had earned his trust. The walls he had built for decades didn't crash. They lowered, quietly, piece by piece. He admitted to loving men, not in passing, not in confusion, but with clarity, with a sense of release. He spoke of a life lived in compartments, public affection for women, private longing for men. He didn't name them all, but he acknowledged there were several, some famous, some not. He described moments of genuine connection, the pain of parting at dawn, the need to pretend nothing happened, and above all, the fear that the world he had conquered would turn against him if it ever knew the truth. "I wasn't ashamed," he said once, "but I was afraid." And he had reason to be. Hollywood wasn't kind to men like him. He had watched other actors, some just as talented, just as magnetic, lose everything over rumors. He had seen careers vanish, headlines twist affection into scandal. The machine that had made him a star could just as easily unmake him. So he made a deal with the system. Give them the hero, and keep the heart locked away. But age changed things. Distance gave perspective. And for the first time, Burt Lancaster saw that the danger had passed, but the damage had not. He looked back on his career with pride, but with an ache for what might have been. What if he had kissed who he wanted to kiss in the sunlight? What if he had loved without strategy, spoken without caution? What roles might he have taken if he wasn't always guarding his truth? What friendships could have gone deeper? What love could have lasted? His late-life admissions weren't loud. They weren't designed to provoke or rewrite his legacy. But they mattered, because in saying what had remained unspoken, he offered something rare in Hollywood: honesty without agenda, vulnerability without spectacle. And in that vulnerability, the myth of Burt Lancaster became something better, something real. He never gave a headline-making confession, never sat on a talk show couch and cried. But to those who knew him in his final years, it was clear that the man who had played gods and generals and lovers had finally stopped performing. He was just Burt, an icon, a father, a man who had loved quietly, who had feared deeply, and who, in the last stretch of his life, had finally stopped running from the one story he had never dared to tell: the hidden story of his own. At Star Hidden Stories, we don't tell these stories to scandalize. We tell them because silence, especially in a place like Hollywood, is its own form of erasure. And Burt Lancaster, for all his towering legacy, carried a truth that nearly disappeared with him. This isn't just about who he loved. It's about what he had to sacrifice in order to be loved by the world. He gave us decades of unforgettable performances. He stood for justice, challenged the studio system, demanded better roles, and delivered. But beneath every moment of triumph was a man carefully protecting the pieces of himself that didn't fit the mold of masculinity America demanded. He wasn't the only one. There were others, many others, who walked the same narrow path, who kissed in the shadows, who changed pronouns in stories, who denied what they longed for just to survive the machine. Hollywood didn't just sell fantasies to the audience. It demanded its stars live them too, even if it meant lying. What makes Lancaster's story so haunting is not that he hid. It's that he hid so well we almost forgot to ask. We've built statues to men like him, strong, silent, commanding. But what if their greatest strength was never in the roles they played, but in the lives they endured behind them? In revisiting these hidden stories, we're not tearing down legends, we're restoring them, giving them back their fullness, their contradictions, their humanity. Burt Lancaster deserves to be remembered not just as a screen icon, but as a man who lived two lives, until he finally found the courage, however late, to bring them together. And in doing so, he didn't lose his legacy. He deepened it. You can still see him there, standing chest deep in the surf beside Deborah Kerr, stealing a kiss that defined an era. You can still feel his voice echo through courtroom speeches, prison walls, and battlegrounds, a voice full of fire and conviction. But now, knowing what we know, there's a new weight beneath the image, a new story, folded beneath the one we grew up with. Maybe Burt Lancaster never intended for us to know this part of him. Maybe the silence was his armor to the very end. Or maybe, just maybe, he hoped that one day someone would care enough to look past the poster, past the myth, and see the man who had always been hiding just off camera. He wasn't perfect. He was complicated, conflicted, brilliant, brave in ways the industry never gave him credit for. He lived a life both grand and quiet, extraordinary and restrained. And in the final frame, when the lights dimmed and the script stopped coming, he left us with something greater than another performance. He left us the truth. Some stories take decades to surface. Some are buried to protect reputations, others to protect hearts. But eventually, the silence gives way. And when it does, the hidden stories speak louder than anything ever filmed.